responsible for the Renaissance, for the reactivation, so to speak, or we can say rejuvenation of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, after the Holocaust. When the Jewish people were decimated and struggling to find their place, in 1950, the Rebbe ascended to the leadership of the Chabad movement following the passing of his father-in-law and began, slowly but surely, an effort to revitalize and re-energize and bring purpose and meaning to living Jewishly in today's day and age. And thousands of Chabad rabbis, emissaries, including all of those here in San Antonio and around Texas and around the United States and literally around the world, are inspired by the teachings, the love, the example of this one individual. How could one individual inspire so many to dedicate their lives to being there for others? And although the Rebbe has not been with us physically for 25 years now, his smile continues to warm us. His encouragement continues to inspire us, and his directives continue to empower us to move forward, to go from strength to strength. And personally, I have known the Rebbe, grew up with the Rebbe since I was a little child. I have memories of the Rebbe waving to me, smiling to me. I have memories of the Rebbe in his private room, extending a silver coin as a reward for repeating my lessons to him. And my father was one of the first people from the secular world to be attracted to the Rebbe's teachings. A young man from Nashville, Tennessee, arrived in Brooklyn in 1952, and the rest is history. Here I am. And there's a special connection for Rabbi Telushkin being here in San Antonio. But first I will mention that his being here today is quite miraculous because his flight was canceled yesterday. Somebody did not want him to be here. And so American Airlines canceled his flight because of trouble in Dallas. And I got on I called American Airlines and they said, well, due to all the stuff that's going on, the lines are backed up and we'll call you back in 2 hours. I said, 2 hours? That's an eternity, 2 hours. So I got online and saw that American had no other flights and booked him the last ticket on United Airlines. So he was able to make it here, and he's here, thank God, with us today. So it was going to happen, meant to be. And so, however, Rabbi Telushkin actually interviewed my father as one of the many that he interviewed to write the book called The Rebbe. So it's a special personal privilege and pleasure for me to welcome Rabbi Telushkin, not yet, to welcome Rabbi Telushkin here to San Antonio. You'll soon hear from him, but you'll appreciate hearing from him because first, I have the great privilege of calling a very, very dear and close friend of mine personally and to the Chabad community as a whole, Rabbi Scheinberg, who has been here, I don't know, close to 50 years already, and Kenai Nahara, Yarich Yomim HaMamlachte. So with that, I introduce to you our Rabbi, Rabbi Scheinberg. Thank you.
Thank you. It gives me really great pleasure to be privileged to speak about one of the giants of Jewry that had a great effect on the Jewish world. And, thank you. The blessings of the Rebbe, or the blessings of any one person, any one rabbi, or any one individual, to be successful, there has to be a certain formula. What is the formula for success? In the Parsha we read on Shabbat, we read about the blessings of the priest, the Kohanim. So there was content, there was what we call tochen, and then there's tzura, how the blessing should be given. In the way the blessing should be given, you will find the success of Chabad. The blessing had to be given first, ponim el ponim. I'll just go through, there's about 6 halachas very quickly. It has to be face-to-face. The Kohanim had to face the congregation. It has to be Beloshon HaKodesh. It had to be in Hebrew, or in the sacred tongue. It had to be Be'ahavo. When the Kohanim blessed, they had to actually love. The Zohar Kodesh says if they didn't love, they couldn't bless. It had to be Ba'amidah. Everyone had to be standing when the blessings were given. It had to be b'kavonas halev. It had to be with sincerity. It had to be said slowly, genuinely. It had to be said with nesiyas kapayim, with the uplifting of the hands. And so I would like to go through that right now, and show how that formula helped change Jewry. First, ponim el ponim, face to face. Obviously, if you take a look at the picture of the shluchim, the kinus hashluchim, you understand that the Rebbe sent his emissaries out into the world, all over the world, ponim el ponim, face to face. And at the same time, wherever they went, they maintained Loshon HaKodesh, the language of holiness, of sanctity, meaning the language of Torah, of Tanakh, of Mishnah, of Halacha, the language of Rabbi Akiva, the language of David HaMelech. They maintained the holiness of purpose, that they were able to do that. Bi'amidah, it has to be said while standing. And Amidah always means standing tall, pride, Jewish pride. In fact, when we say in Pirkei Avos, Hamidu Talmidim Habe, that you establish many students, it means you make them proud to be Jewish. It had to be be'ahavo. It had to be with love. You know, there's a simple formula for kiruv in Pirkei Avos. Oyev sabriyos umekavan laTorah. If you love people, you'll be mekavan, you'll bring them closer to Torah. So it had to be be'ahavo. It had to be b'kavonos halev. Kavonos halev means that you had to be sincere. You had to be genuine in what you're doing and what you're saying. And of course, the shluchim are not only sincere and genuine, but they're clear. They're clear about their purpose and their mission. And it had to be nesiyas kapayim, with uplifting of the hands. Uplifting of the hands means that you look upwards, you see upwards. When you talk to the Jewish community, you see their sacred potential, what they could be, not just what they are, but what they could be. Nesiyas kapayim. And it had to be, of course, not only with nesiyas kapayim and kavonas halev. It had to be, at the end, to be successful, it had to have siyata dishmaya, God's help, God's desire, God's love. All of that is the blessing, koi sevorachu. Koi is 25. Koi sevorachu, 25 years after the Rebbe's Ptira, you still have all of the success of ponim el ponim, face to face, ba'ahavo, with love, with Loshon HaKodesh, with the sacred sources of our people, with nesiyas kapayim, with the uplifting of the hands to see the potential sanctity of every Jew. Thank you. That my blessing is that this is 25 years, that at Bias Goyel we could see again the success of the Rebbe's bracha.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Scheinberg, for those very, very heartfelt and inspiring words. A couple of individuals that I would like to recognize and thank and acknowledge their assistance and special contribution to this evening. Firstly, I'd like to thank Stephen Elaine Cohen for enabling Rabbi Telushkin to come here this evening. Thank you so much. Yasher Koyach. And I'd like to thank Linda Wolf for preparing the desserts for us that we will enjoy after the program, and Nomi Grossbaum for baking the cakes that will be served, God willing, after the program as well. I'd like to thank Josh Rinder for providing the video of tonight's events. Thank you so much, Josh. Limelight Photography for your next wedding. And I'd also like to thank Alan Smith, who is here somewhere taking some pictures. Thank you so much, Alan. At this time, I'd like to call upon Ronit Sherwin, who is the CEO of our own Jewish Federation of San Antonio, who does so much for our community and for our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel. She works tirelessly, day and night, for our community, and it's a privilege and pleasure to ask her to come and say a few words on behalf of the Jewish Federation.
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Block, for asking me to offer greetings on behalf of the Federation. It is an honor to do so for two reasons. This is a very special occasion, the 25th Yahrtzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson of blessed memory. And secondly, we have the pleasure of hosting Rabbi Telushkin in our community. While I never had the privilege of meeting the Rebbe, my life has been touched profoundly by his teachings. The following teaching, which I will share with you, has impacted my work as a Jewish communal professional and as a human being. It goes as follows. If you want to love God, you need to love people. I have always been a spiritual individual, believing very strongly that God is most present in our relationships between other human beings. I learned this most personally from my dear friend, Rebbetzin Paula Rifkin of blessed memory, who befriended me in St. Louis over 20 years ago. While Paula was not a Chabadnik per se, she gifted me with the book, The Rebbe's Army. I devoured the book and was struck by how the teachings of it resonated with me as someone devoted to working in the Jewish community. The idea of, if you want to love God, you need to love people, resonated very profoundly. As well, my deep friendship with Paula Rifkin was not based on our shared religious practices, as we were quite different, but our deep love for Judaism and for each other. It is also a great honor to be here with Rabbi Telushkin. I first heard Rabbi Telushkin speak some 18 years ago at the Jewish Book Festival in St. Louis, Missouri. I was a Jewish educator at the time and frequently referenced his book, Jewish Literacy, in my Melton adult education classes. And it was such a treat to hear him in person and learn as well that he too embraced a love for people, all people, regardless of affiliation or belief. So thank you, Rabbi Block, for allowing me to share some words of greeting, and thank you, Rabbi Telushkin, for being here in our community.
I grew up in the golden age of Lubavitch. So from a very young age, there were so many opportunities to see the Rebbe, to interface with the Rebbe. The Rebbe was there to lift us up, to give us perspective, solace when necessary, encouragement, to share the joys. A world with the Rebbe in it was a world that had an anchor.
I was a reporter at the New York Times from 1975 to 1993. And in those years, I had many opportunities to write about the growth of the Lubavitch movement and to write about Rabbi Schneerson in particular. I think most celebrities are people that you may admire, but you don't get a sense that they care that much about you. The Rebbe was different. He really cared about every person.
אבא שלו, בפעם הראשונה, זה הצלחה רבה, בשביל הסיור שלו בציורים שלו, הצלחה רבה. הצלחה רבה בכל הציורים החדשים. I have not seen you a long time, all since I arrived.
It could be a little bit better.
Then it will be a lot better.
Amen.
בנצל כל האפשריות, להפיץ היהדות האמיתית, ומתייחסים לך בטוב לבו.
כן, אני יודעת.
ירכב גם כן בישורות טובות בענייניך הפרטיים.
אוי, תודה. תודה.
והעבודה שלי היא גם כן הסתרבות בעניינים הפרטיים של כל הפנים מלאי.
זה יותר חשוב לי ממה שאמרת עד עכשיו.
He wanted you to be a better person. He wanted you to be a better Jew. He wanted you to practice the rituals and the commandments of Judaism. Those things would make you a better person and make the world better.
I am a writer, primarily on Jewish themes, and I've recently completed a 5-year project on the Rebbe. The Rebbe had a greater capacity than anyone I've ever come across to appreciate that a human being is created in the divine image. He saw that spark of divinity in every Jew, that every Jew therefore was connected, even if that person felt distant now.
You're not changing anything, you're only returning to your real essence and doing so on your own volition, and then it will come to you automatically to progress in all things of Yiddishkeit.
The Rebbe was still seeing that divine spark within them. He saw not only who they were now, he saw also what they could become and how precious they were.
Ich habe gekommen zu finden, ein bisschen Jüdischkeit, ein bisschen mein Jüdischkeit.
Und
ich will helfen.
Ich war versucht, bei sich im Herzen zu finden, eine Sache mehr, die sich findet noch da. Weil das Zerrissen von der Herz, wir werden aktiv und noch viel mit euch Ganzen. Das jüdische Herz.
When one walked into the Rebbe's study, you saw nothing but the Rebbe. It was not an ostentatious office. It's not like going into the president or governor's offices or even deans of law schools. The Rebbe's office was not that at all. It was him. He can't enforce anything he wants. All he can do is advise and suggest. And that distinguishes him from every other leader I've met. They have the power of the purse, they have the power of the sword, they have the power of the media, they have the power of law. Rebbe has no power, only the authority that he himself brings through his personality and his leadership.
Yes. What happened to the book?
Well, I'm doing some things in that direction, which I'll inform you as it goes along.
It takes you too long here.
You're right.
You have much more things to do after you finish that.
Okay.
This was a wonderful year, Baruch Hashem, but this was our greatest accomplishment of 1988. To be elected a senator was nice, but this was the best.
But don't be satisfied. It's only with you.
Okay, we both heard.
That depends more on you, probably. Hebt sich auch herumgucken, wird man erschrocken, was tut sich das in der Welt. und was mit der le der und mit Schone le Schone, ist achscher dore bit mir. Am Gitze Hakuke nieder Hele Katevis Geber und nieder Seder wird als starker und nicht gedusche Beruchni ist Meschel beschälet nor Lechiere Leheper. Aber das ist eine Linie von einem Jahr, was dort gewaltigen Chayis Reus.
The Rebbe's mission was to call the world's bluff and reach right in and invert its reality and expose the core, expose the goodness. And he did that on every level, to the world entire, to each person he touched.
Wir soll wissen sein, dass wir gefühlt sich in einer teure Welt. Das ist eine Welt, wo sie ist Agam. Und nicht stamm a Sode, eise Tvur, nur das Agam von eise Peres. Das ist eine Samen-Welt, wo der Rebbe sagt, dass das ein Paradies, wo das ein Paradische Leben.
Just imagine that you are an eagle and you were raised as a duck. So you think that you are a duck and you live like a duck, and sometimes raises you and you find out that's an eagle. Then you spread your wings and go. You soar up to heaven. You are now above all these things. So that is what's called the touch the Rebbe had. And it was a spark, went there and ignited them. And the person is not only didn't return to what he was, he changed completely from one place to another.
Die Chance mit verbindet sich mit der Sache, wo sie gefühlt sich eben, mit der Sache, wo sie Limelight min Azman und min Amoke, ist Afal Pi, was gefühlt sich in Zman und in Moke, gibt ihm der Eberste die Möglichkeit, als ich in See, wird durchführen den Ebersten Schlichus. Die Chance mit verbunden eben, oder dämmelt fällt mir nicht unten.
The influence of the Jewish people is a big task. But nevertheless, every Jew has the power to do so because he is going with the help of the blessing of God Almighty himself.
Well, I promise I'll do my best.
Yeah, God Almighty will help you.
Lubavitcher Jews around the world today began 7 days of mourning for their beloved leader, Rabbi Schneerson.
Rabbi Schneerson was a great leader of the Lubavitcher people. He was a great religious leader of the Jewish people. He was also a great religious leader of all people all throughout the world.
I was aware that he was not well, but his death, of course, was devastating to everybody in the world. Who could ever succeed this Rebbe? I mean, he was such a giant.
The Rebbe rewrote the book on what it meant to be a Hasidic leader. The Rebbe sort of broke down that wall and said, I have something to give and to contribute and to teach to all Jews. He was one of a kind. So with him gone, how could the movement survive?
The Rebbe's passing was a loss on a personal level, but beyond that, it seemed to be the eclipse of a light the world needed so badly. That was the true loss. But as it turned out, that was never lost. It lives on in the Rebbe's teaching, in the Rebbe's direction, that fuel our work today.
When you are stranded in the wilderness, you really don't know anything. So you have a light, and the light guides you, and then somehow the light is extinguished in the middle of the night in some moment. How do you feel that? And you have, on the other hand, you don't have any permission to stop. See, and the Rebbe gave an order, marching orders, and so you have to go on marching.
For the Rebbe, there was nothing more precious than every single human being, and there was nothing more precious than every single mitzvah. The marching orders were, bring these two preciousnesses together.
Shasayit tut a mitzvah in der Welt,
Und tut als Schliches hat mit den Nebelchen Quajochen. Wir dürfen natürlich sagen, den Vater als Afromerie ist jeder Mitzvah, was tut, auf seiner Matone, was gibt den Nebelchen.
One of the ways in which this book itself profoundly influenced me was the Rebbe's insistence on the importance of every mitzvah, which brings me now, when I do a mitzvah, to have a much greater increased sense of its power to affect me.
את מדליקן בשבת. אז את תראה שכל החברות שלו יעשו גם כן כך. Everywhere was it putting tefillin, you eat and you are true to you. Someone else, he must begin putting tefillin. That alone is a very worthwhile endeavor. For adding a Jew to put tefillin. You're welcome.
You know, the greatest immortality somebody can ever have is to leave a legacy and to see one's work continue after one sheds the mortal coil. And the Rebbe did a phenomenal job in preparing his movement, the Jewish world, and the entire world.
To think that he had built this movement from the time he became Rebbe in the 1950, 1951, and it had this phenomenal growth, that growth would have continued sort of exponentially after his passing is kind of hard to imagine, hard to believe. It just shows that, you know, the power of the message that he had, and that he has been able to, in some ways, transcend life.
The Rebbe saw each person as a stakeholder in this awesome project. We have the responsibility and the privilege of moving it forward. By adding one new mitzvah, everyone can become a stakeholder in the Rebbe's project as it continues to move forward and to grow.
Und als Meisef, ein Meise, ein Dibu, ein Achlot, lezad Atev, ist Meisef, was peilt auf sich, peilt rechet al Bnei Beise, und peilt, wie der Rambam schreibt, als Psag Din, al kol ha'elam kuli umachrie lekar schus. Bringt uns die Gejule bepeil mamash nitech simcha vetuv levo.
That'll be easy to follow. Well, I'm here to introduce Rabbi Telushkin, who is one of the most prominent speakers on Judaism in the United States. And he's well known for his book called Jewish Literacy, which is a major selling book in the United States for the last 2 decades, which is about the most important things to know about the Jewish religion, its people, and its history. And it's a widely acclaimed text. In 2014, he published the book about the Rebbe, which I have read and enjoyed, and it tells us about the chronology of how Chabad has grown, which is just a remarkable story, some of which you have just seen. And he did 5 years of research on this book. He was educated and ordained at Yeshiva University and had graduate studies at Columbia University. He lives in New York. He has 4 children, and he lectures throughout the United States. I actually met Rabbi Telushkin in Chicago when he was talking to the Jewish Learning Institute about his book, The Rebbe. And at that time, one of his children was quite ill, and I helped him out that night. And Rabbi Block did not let Rabbi Telushkin forget. So that's one of the reasons I believe he's here. Rabbi Telushkin.
Two quick requests. Could somebody lend me a watch? Because I don't want to use my cell phone and I don't want to speak too long. Okay, thank you. And if somebody gets a chance, ta-da, I will give it back. It's a nice watch though. Okay, and if somebody could bring me, do I have water up here by any chance? Okay, good. Can I pull this out? Yeah. Good. Okay, first of all, I want to acknowledge the great love of the Telushkin family for a number of people, but number one, Dr. Cohen, who really did play a role. My son, I think he said at the time it was the sickest looking throat he had ever seen. And this man has a lot of experience. So my son really was quite ill, and it was a wonderful occasion. And the whole reading, everything here, it's funny, when I saw, by the way, could somebody really bring me water? I have a problem with my throat. Dr. Cohen, could you come? Okay. He's retired, but I think I still trust his judgment. When I saw that clip, hey, thank you, Tadarabah. When I saw that little clip there of Joe Lieberman speaking, and it reminded me of an event. I spoke at a Chabad event in Riverdale that was in honor of Hadassah Lieberman, and Joe Lieberman also spoke there. And there had been a story I had heard, which I always assumed was a joke, but he verified it actually had happened. In 2000, as you remember, it was a rather undecided sort of election at first, and he thought he was about to become vice president of the United States. And then, of course, there was that whole thing in Florida. And he said he woke up the next morning in a pretty bad mood because the whole preceding day he thought he was about to become vice president, and then it didn't happen. And he said that when he came downstairs in the morning, his wife said to him, "Joe, don't worry, in this house you'll always be vice president." What I set out to do in the book Rebbe was to tell the story of what I think really has become the most dynamic religious movement in Jewish life for the past hundreds of years, certainly within the religious Jewish life. When Menachem Mendel Schneerson assumed leadership of Chabad in 1951, Chabad was a pretty small movement located, generally focused in the Crown Heights in one area in Brooklyn. And then, of course, it had this extraordinary reach. But when I speak to people who were there already from the early 50s, it became clear that from the beginning he had a broad sense of where Chabad could go. And I think it was not by accident that the Rebbe rises to leadership and inaugurates this movement only 6 years after the Holocaust had ended. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs put it, if the Nazis hunted down every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wanted to search out every Jew in love. And that's really what Chabad set out to do. It would have been inconceivable. Until 2 years ago, there were Chabad houses in 49 of the 50 states. This Chabad now is in over 100 countries. If you know the answer, don't give it. I just want to have people guess. What do you think was the 50th state to get a Chabad house? I have a personal attachment to it because the guy who's there, Mendel Alperovich, was my research assistant on this book. Anybody want to take a guess? Alaska. Alaska's had a Chabad house for a long time. Goes back to the 70s. Mississippi was 49. Somebody always invariably guesses Hawaii, and then I say to them, let me ask you a question. If you were a Chabad shliach and they showed you 50 states, do you really think Hawaii would be your last choice? I remember somebody said to me Montana, and I said, no, Montana's had one. I spoke to the shliach there, Rabbi Brook, whose goal is to get every single Jewish household in Miami to put up a mezuzah. And when I interviewed him, he had just come from a city in Montana that sounds like a shtetl. He had come from Whitefish, Montana. Okay, anybody else? North Dakota, you're about as close as can be. South Dakota. So Mendel Alperovich is now in South Dakota. Every year, who knows where the biggest Seder in the world is held every year? It's in Nepal, in Kathmandu. They have over 1,100 people. A lot of young Israelis it's not that Kathmandu has such a permanently gigantic Jewish community. A lot of young Israelis, after they get out of the army, go traveling throughout the world, and it's become known. It's largely Israelis who go there. They have 1,100 people in Kathmandu. There are 6 cities in Thailand. How many people can name any cities in Thailand other than Bangkok? There are 6 cities in Thailand that have a total of about 3,000 people come to their Siddurim every year. I remember my friend Dennis Prager years ago spent a Shabbat at the Chabad house in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. There were people there from 10 different countries. And one of the remarkable statements that was made some years after the Rebbe's death by Rabbi Eric Yaffe, the longtime president of the Union for Reform Judaism, said, "It's hard for me to say it, but I will say it nonetheless. We must follow the example of Chabad." Interestingly, and I sort of regret a little that one of the quotes they have there, I think they cut out some of what I had said. The Rebbe really saw the sanctity and the divine spark. I'm quoted as saying they're in every Jew, but he actually saw it in every human being. And the Rebbe really did reach out in a way that was unusual, and I'll give you an example of it. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first black woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. 68, as you recall, was a very different time in American life. It was only 4 years after passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, and a lot of Democratic congressmen from the South dominated in the House and had a lot of control there. And they assigned Shirley Chisholm, who wanted to be on the Education Committee, on a Labor Committee, they assigned her to the Agriculture Committee, leading one New York newspaper to headline, "A Tree Grows in Brooklyn." You know, she came from the Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights area of Brooklyn. She didn't want to go to the House to be on the Agricultural Committee. One of her constituents, indeed, because she covered part of Crown Heights, was the Rebbe. And Shirley Chisholm, who was a strong figure, was very public about how unhappy she was with this appointment. And she gets a call from Rabbi Chodakov, the Rebbe's assistant, who said the Rebbe would love to meet with her. She knew the Rebbe. All New York politicians knew the Rebbe because everybody would come to him during election time. The Rebbe would always give people a blessing, and of course he would not publicly favor one candidate over another. But anyway, she comes to see him, and he says, "I understand you're upset." She said, "I'm upset, I'm insulted." And she went on, and the Rebbe then said to her, "What a blessing God has given you. This country has so much surplus food. There are so many hungry people. You can use this gift that God has given you to feed hungry people. You just have to find a creative way to do it." The first day Chisholm was in Congress, she meets the newly elected Republican senator from Kansas, a former representative, Bob Dole. Dole was upset because a lot of farmers in Kansas were suffering at the time. There was a surplus, they didn't know what to do with it. She works with Dole, and they greatly expand the Food Stamps Act. And then a few years later, Chisholm plays a major role with Hubert Humphrey and with Dole in the WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, to make sure that people were given enough food. The whole story about this comes out really 15 years later, in 1983, when Chisholm retires, and at her retirement breakfast, she tells the story of that meeting she had had with the Rebbe. And then she says something remarkable. She said, "A rabbi who is an optimist taught me that what you think is a challenge is a gift from God." And she added, "If poor babies have milk and poor children have food, it's because that rabbi in Crown Heights had vision." So right away we know we're dealing with a different sort of figure who's reaching out to a broader constituency. And this was really one of the remarkable things that happened. As was mentioned there in this film, the Rebbe was very convinced that every act counts. And I remember in 1962, I was a teenager when John Glenn circled the world. And John Kennedy, who was then president, announced that it was the American goal that by the end of the decade, there would be a man on the moon. And one of the comments that Kennedy made was he quoted a famous Chinese proverb, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." In a sense, that's what I assumed was also the Rebbe's approach, that any mitzvah can be the beginning of the journey that's 1,000 miles. I then eventually, as I was working on the book, came to realize the Rebbe's approach was actually broader than that. underlying that proverb, which is obviously a very wise and inspiring proverb, underlying that proverb is the presumption that every step counts because it's part of that journey. It's going to lead to that. The Rebbe's insight, the Rebbe's insight was deeper. The Rebbe felt, we'll go out to a pharmacy afterwards. The Rebbe felt that every step mattered, even if it didn't culminate in the journey. That's what his insight was. Every mitzvah matters on its own, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. The Rebbe's tefillin campaign. For those of you who don't know what tefillin are, they're phylacteries. Now you know. The truth of the matter is, the only thing you know is if somebody uses the word phylacteries, they don't put it on. But the Rebbe's tefillin campaign, when it started, had a very stimulating, interesting reaction in the Jewish community. All of a sudden, you had trucks, and it started really in New York City. It had started a little earlier, but the real campaign starts in '74 in New York City. And people are stopped on the street and asked, "Are you Jewish?" And if a man said he was, they would invite him in to put on tefillin. If it was a woman, they would give her Shabbos candles. By the way, it's interesting that the Rebbe took those two mitzvahs together, because think about it. When is the one day in the week you don't put on tefillin? On Shabbos. So any couple that would undertake to do tefillin and Shabbos candles, it would mean they were doing something Jewish every day of the week. But anyway, so a lot of Jews are uncomfortable with this campaign. Obviously, a lot of more secular Jews, first of all, a lot of Jews are uncomfortable altogether with the idea of somebody stopping them on the street and saying, "Are you Jewish?" And secondly, the idea of people putting on tefillin in public, it's a very unusual looking thing. So a lot of Jews, particularly more secular Jews, didn't like it. What is less well known is that in the Orthodox world, there were people who opposed the campaign, particularly because they thought, what, are you going to take some Jew who's not at all observant, and you're going to get him to put on tefillin, and then he'll put on tefillin, and then he'll go into a coffee shop and get bacon and eggs or something? There's no sense to it. And the Rebbe said, no, it has value. Just putting on tefillin has value. First of all, you have no idea how it will affect the person in terms of other behavior. But it was the ability to see that every act had value in and of itself. Rather than always making things part of a broader program and it only works if all these other things happen, the Rebbe's insight was that every act had value in and of itself. By the way, very much significant in that campaign was, of course, also the candle lighting campaign. When I was growing up in New York for years, there would be a little classified ad on the front page of the New York Times on Friday. It was the only ad, and today the Times has ads sometimes on the front page. For years, that was the only one they ever had, a little classified ad, Jewish women and girls. Candle lighting today is at 5:18. And I'll tell you a funny story about it. One of the people who's in that documentary is Ari Goldman, who literally sits next to me on one side in shul every Shabbos. And Ari told me, Ari was the only person ever hired by the New York Times with the proviso they didn't have to work on Shabbat or on Jewish holidays. Anyway, Ari told me that on January 1st, 2000, if you look it up, the New York Times published a special edition. It was a new millennium. And so they published a special edition with three front pages. One was the front page for January 1st, 2000. One is they republished the front page from January 1st, 1900. And then they imagined the front page from January 1st, 2100. And it had all sorts of disturbing articles on it. Should robots be allowed to vote in elections? There were, and many terms that, obviously we couldn't even understand what they were talking about. And then smack in the middle of the page was, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting time tonight is. It turned out that the special editor who had been assigned to do that page, who I believe Ari told me was an Irish Catholic, had seen that January 1st, 2000 was Friday. So 2100. January 1st, 2100 will really be on a Friday. So he called up Chabad and asked them what time candle lighting would be on January 1st, 2100. I'm assuming whoever answered probably said, if the Messiah has not come yet at that point, and gave him the time because it's all clocked out. So they put it in. that story, I think, actually explains a lot about the success of Chabad. And I'll tell you in one way also. As a general rule, movements raise their funding and get their support from people who are adherents of that movement. So if you'd see if there's a large new building built at the Hebrew Union College, the seminary of the Reform movement, I'm sure the overwhelming majority of money comes from people who are affiliated with the Reform movement. It goes like that in the conservative movement. It goes like that in almost all other Orthodox movements. Chabad stands out because so much of its support comes from people who are not necessarily observant of Judaism in the same way that Chabad is. And I think part of the reason is conveyed in that story. There are a lot of Jews in America who feel passionate about their Jewishness, who love their Jewishness, who want Judaism to survive, but who are not yet so confident that their great-grandchildren and great-granddaughters will be lighting Shabbat candles in 2100. What they are confident of is that there will be Chabadniks going around trying to make sure on January 1st, 2100, that people are lighting Chabad candles, and that helps really explain what happened. When I set out to write the book on the Rebbe, I wanted to focus. It really isn't a biography of his whole life, though I put in details in the back of the book that cover his whole life. But I was really most interested in the second half of his life, which was his years of leadership. I remember I was very close with a man named Zalman Shmatkin. Zalman has been for a long time the head of Chabad.org. And Zalman kept urging me to write something about the Rebbe, and I wrote, and he said, and don't publish it in an Orthodox publication. Publish it in a broader publication. So I published it in The Forward, which is a fairly secular Jewish magazine, and it was on the 12th Yahrtzeit of the Rebbe. And one of the things that struck me as I was writing the article was, when a charismatic leader dies, what generally happens is the movement at best stays where it was, and even more often it actually starts to go into decline. And Chabad in this regard had defied what generally happens, because at that point, 12 years after the Rebbe's death, the number of shluchim had about doubled. Now it's, obviously has increased even more. So I realized we're dealing with the rarest type of leader. A leader who dies and the movement continues to expand in the aftermath of his or her death becomes and that's what I wanted to really trace. So what were some of the things that really stood out and made the Rebbe unique? Well, one thing in his approach is his unconditional love of his fellow Jews, and his love of humanity in general. So you could argue, well, that's not so special. The most famous law in the Torah is one of the two, v'ahavta l'et Hashem, and you shall love the Lord your God, v'ahavta l'reacha, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And not only that, in the Talmud we find Rabbi Akiva, Hillel says, this is the essence of Judaism, da'alech hasani, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. Akiva is even more specific. Akiva says, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is a or the major principle of the Torah. So what makes the Rebbe's emphasis on love, therefore, so unusual? Because despite the fact of what Hillel said, despite the fact of what Akiva said, despite the fact what was in the Torah, guess what? It wasn't really practiced. The Talmud itself attributes the destruction of the Second Temple to sinat chinam, to causeless hatred in the Jewish community. I've always thought only an anti-Semitic non-Jew could believe in the protocols of the elders of Zion, that the whole Jewish world is united in a conspiracy. Anybody who knows the Jewish world from within knows it's not united. There is, these fights take place. So the Talmud, as I said, speaks of sinat chinam. I'll give you an example. In 1232, the Dominicans within the Catholic Church are empowered by the Pope to establish an inquisition, to root out heresy within Catholicism. And they start burning books. And then a group of three rabbis come to them, and they said, there is a Jewish heretic whose writings should also be burned. And so they hand over the writings of this Jewish heretic to be burned, and the Dominicans are happy to do it. The Dominican, and who is the heretic whose writings they handed over? Maimonides, Rambam. Because they claimed that there were certain things in Sefer Hamada, in the first volume of Maimonides' classical Mishnah Torah, the Jewish law, and even more so in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed. The Dominicans start investigating Jewish heresy, and then they start finding passages in the Talmud that are very offensive to Christians, and in 1240, they burned the Talmud. Now, the burning of the Talmud at any time would be a travesty, but in the year 1240, it was infinitely worse than it would be at a later period. Why? Because there was no printing presses. They burned 2,400 volumes of the Talmud. Each one of them had been handwritten. So it was a terrible tragedy. One of the rabbis who had been involved in denouncing Maimonides was a rabbi named Yonah Gerundi. Yonah Gerundi was so upset at what he had done that he wrote a book called Sharei Tshuva, The Paths of Repentance, which to this day is studied in yeshivas as a classic work on how to repent. Because he saw what could happen when that love stops. Terrible things could ensue. I'll give you a few examples, though, of how the Rebbe tried to counter it. A young rabbi comes to meet the Rebbe, Israel Meir Lau. Israel Meir Lau subsequently becomes very famous because he subsequently becomes a chief rabbi of Israel. But he was a young rabbi at the time, and he comes to meet the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, so what sort of work are you now doing? He said, I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim. Kiruv Rechokim is a Hebrew term that literally means bringing near those who are far away, and it's a term used among religious Jews with trying to bring near non-religious Jews to make them more religious. The Rebbe surprises him by what he answers. He said, how do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachok? How do we know who's near? How do we know who's far away? They're all precious in God's eyes. In other words, the Rebbe did not want those Jews who were more religiously observant to start seeing themselves as superior to other people. The prophets preached righteousness. They didn't preach self-righteousness. So so the Rebbe immediately has a new way. He uses words in a different way. I'm going to have occasion to speak later about how he uses words in a different way. But I want to get a sense of how many people here might know Hebrew. How do you say hospital in Hebrew? Beit Cholim. It's the only word I know for hospital. The Rebbe didn't like that expression. The Rebbe wanted all hospitals to call themselves Beit Refuah. Why? Because those of you who know Hebrew, what does Beit Cholim literally mean? The house of the sick. The Rebbe said, that's a very discouraging way to speak to people. Why don't you call yourselves Beit Refuah, the house of healing? He said, not only is that more encouraging, it actually represents what hospitals are supposed to do. When I heard that the Rebbe had done it, I heard it from a man named Simon Jacobson, who's a big scholar within Chabad. When I heard that, it reminded me that when I was a teenager, quite a while ago, my mom had told me that when she was growing up in New York, they used to have hospitals in New York, I'm sure you've heard of them, called Home for the Incurables. They used to can you imagine? How many of you ever heard of a home for the incurable? Yeah. My mother said that they used to have Jewish homes for the incurables. They had Catholic homes for the incurables. Could you imagine saying to somebody, oh, we're transferring you tomorrow? And my mother said, but when she was growing up, that was the term used, and it was only later in life that she realized how incredibly insensitive it was. That's exactly what the Rebbe didn't want. So he wanted people to not use these sort of judgmental terms. We're involved in Kiruv Rechokim. I remember one of the people I interviewed in the book was a man I'm quite friendly with, George Rohr. George and the Rohr family have been incredible philanthropic supporters of Chabad. But George himself is also quite a knowledgeable Jew, and he's been a member forever at KJ, Kilas Yeshurim, a modern Orthodox shul on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And one year, he created at that shul a beginner's minyan for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. What's a beginner's minyan? Any of you who've gone to an Orthodox service know that the service is pretty much entirely in Hebrew, and there are a lot of it's quite a lot of prayers. Judaism has never practiced the zero-sum game. They've never said if we're going to add on a prayer, then we'll subtract another prayer. So the prayer service has can be quite long. And so what they do at a beginner service is they focus on fewer prayers, not all of them, and they discuss their meaning. So George, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, went to see the Rebbe and said to the Rebbe, this was quite late in the Rebbe's life, and it's going to be relevant why I say that in a minute. So he says to the Rebbe with great pride, I want the Rebbe to know that I conducted a Rosh Hashanah service for 180 Jews with no background. The Rebbe didn't acknowledge him in any way and actually seemed almost a little irritated, so George did what many of us do when we're speaking to an older person. He just repeated what he had said in a louder voice. I want the Rebbe to know I conducted a service for 180 Jews with no background. The Rebbe said, what do you mean they had no background? They're the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Again, he didn't want that sort of self-righteousness that could come in when you're thinking they don't know their background. They have a background. They have a background that they should be proud of. Now, also, when I speak of the Rebbe's love, the Rebbe had to a remarkable degree a trait that I call moral imagination. What do I mean by moral imagination? When we think back to the 20th century until now, one of the things we're struck by in a positive way has been incredible advances in medicine and science and technology. In the final analysis, those advances came about because an individual or a group of people used the full resources of their intellectual imagination to solve problems that had been previously thought to be insoluble. But when you look morally at moral developments, it's a mixed bag since the 20th century. I'm not going to say there were no improvements. Certainly, there have been improvements in the status of women. There have been improvements in the status of mentally challenged. In many areas there have been. But we also know that the 20th century witnessed the greatest mass murders in history. One of the reasons I suspect is people rarely use the full resources of their moral imagination to use their intellectual moral imagination to find ways to solve problems that have really happened. That's what the Rebbe did. One story from my family's life, which probably has a lot to do with also why I ended up writing this book, concerns that. My father, Shlomo Telushkin, alav hashalom, my father, Shlomo Telushkin of blessed memory, was the Rebbe's accountant. He was the accountant for Chabad even actually before the Rebbe. Chabad came to the United States in 1940. The first person who arrived was the Rebbe's father-in-law, the sixth Rebbe. And my father became the accountant at that time. My grandfather had a relationship with the sixth Rebbe and had a strong relationship, very strong relationship with Chabad. And so my father became their accountant. In 1986, I was living in Israel, and I get a call from my mom that my father had had a stroke and that obviously I should come home immediately. I did. My father was in a coma for several days. And every day we got 2 phone calls from the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is. Finally, I'm with my father, and he comes out of the coma. And a few days later, I get a call from Rabbi Krinsky, the Rebbe's very, very close assistant, aide. And Rabbi Krinsky said, we had a meeting of the VAD, we had a meeting of the leadership this morning, and a question came up involving accounting, and the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo. So I said to him, Rabbi Krinsky, you know how sick, my father was in ICU, you know how sick he is. The Rebbe said, of course. The Rebbe, we said that, and the Rebbe, of course, did remember. But he said, nonetheless, this is a question for Shlomo. So I went in and I asked my father the question, and he looks at me and he gives me an answer. And when I left, I remember being struck by what had happened and by the Rebbe's moral imagination. The Rebbe's sitting there in Brooklyn. He's thinking about issues that are affecting Jews all over the world, and he's also thinking about my father. My father, I always say, was like a person who was running. My father was 80 at the time, but had always been in very good health. I said he was like a person who was running full speed straight into a brick wall. Because all of a sudden he has a stroke. He can no longer really practice accounting. My father used to give a weekly shiur in Talmud, and he can no longer, do that. And it was feeling there, obviously, quite depressed. And the Rebbe, by asking him a question, gave him the opportunity to see that there were still things he could do. He was still needed. But that's not even the full extent of it. Because then I thought about it.
the Rebbe didn't ask such a simple-minded question, that it would have been almost condescending for my father, but he also didn't want to ask a question that would be so complicated my father wouldn't be able to answer it. So that's what I mean. When you use your intellectual, moral imagination, the terrible thing is I don't remember what the question was. I should have written it down, obviously, at the time, and I didn't. And then I'm speaking to a Rabbi Shmuel Kaplan, who's been a Chabad Shliach forever in Baltimore. And he told me a remarkable story. Again, the moral imagination of the Rebbe. Kaplan, as a young man, had gotten married and was studying in a Chabad kollel. A kollel is a yeshiva. Usually it's done for young married students and gives them and they are paid a stipend so that they can continue learning. And Rabbi Chodakov approaches him and says there's a young woman, a 17-year-old woman, who's going through a period of tremendous doubts and anger at her parents and anger at God and anger at Judaism, and the Rebbe is interested that she have somebody she could be in contact with. And so Kaplan is appointed, and he meets with the young woman, and he said it was like teenage rebellion, but a rather extreme teenage rebellion. What was remarkable to him, though, was that the girl wrote notes to the Rebbe. He would bring them in, and he said the Rebbe would always answer within a day or 2 days at the very most. And then one time, she writes to the Rebbe about the pain that she's in, and the Rebbe writes back to her, and he says, Ani margish et tzarech. I feel your pain. And the girl somehow was not assuaged by this. She says to Kaplan, how does he know what my pain is? How does he know what he can feel? And she writes back an angry letter to the Rebbe that I said, I don't believe you. Kaplan said he got an answer back within 2 hours, and this is what the Rebbe answered. When you will merit to grow up and marry, and God willing have a child, the nature of things are that in the first year, towards the end of the first year of a child's life, a child begins to teethe. And teething is a painful process, and the child cries as a result. And the mother feels that pain as if it were her own. Kach ani margish et tzarech. And the mother feels that pain as if it were her own. That's how I feel your pain. Kaplan said, in all the time he was working with her, that was the first thing that got through. It was the first time that she felt somebody really understood who she was and what she was going through. And I saw Kaplan a couple of years ago. He told me he's still in touch with the woman. She's a grandmother now. And that really had the effect. So this was his love, the imaginative nature of his love. And one of the things that Ari, said, how he really could make everybody to whom he speaks to feel their importance in it. By the way, how did the Rebbe do it? This is another aspect of the Rebbe that I found very, very remarkable. He spoke about Hatzlacha Bizman. What does Hatzlacha Bizman mean? It means how do you have success with time? How many of you find that at the end of the day, you often have not done all that you hoped you were going to do that day? How many of you are willing to tell the truth? No, okay, okay. A lot more hands went up. Okay. The Rebbe had a fascinating theory about Hatzlacha Bizman, which came out in a talk that he gave in 1971. And he recounted an incident that had happened in 1927, shortly before his father-in-law was banished, basically, which saved his life, was banished from the Soviet Union. He was being followed around by the KGB, all the bad things that were happened, and he was about to go. They were in Leningrad. I had the zchut, I had the merit of visiting Leningrad and actually being there in the house where the previous Rebbe was living, and he was about to go to Moscow, and he was going to be leaving in an hour on a train, and he knew he was going to be followed by the KGB, and he knew they were trying to look for excuses to arrest him, and the whole household are nervous wrecks. But he walks into the room of his soon-to-be father-in-law, and he's sitting there calmly working on notes and other things, and he said, how can you be so calm? And he said, let me tell you what my father taught me about time. He said, we all know there's a limited amount of time. There are 24 hours in a day, and no matter what you do, you can't get more than that, and no matter what happens, it's not going to be less than that in a day. He said, the only way a human being can accomplish what he or she has to accomplish is therefore to focus on what they're doing now.
They said of a certain Rebbe, what's the most important thing to your Rebbe? He says, what he was working on now. The Rebbe said, what destroys many people's ability to accomplish what they can do is they can't stay fully focused on what they are working on at that time. So what ends up happening? Thoughts intrude from the past. Suddenly they're thinking through about encounters they had earlier or other things from their childhood or other things, or thoughts from the future. What am I going to do about that? But they can't stay fully focused on what is in front of them now. So his father-in-law said to him, whatever's going to happen is not going to be affected. We've made all the plans that we can possibly make for this trip to Moscow. Nothing we can do now can affect it. All I can do is work on what I'm working on now. This is not an easy thing to do, but it affected me. People sometimes ask me, how did things you learned in the book affect you? Try and practice it for 5 minutes at a time. For 5 minutes, only think about that you're working on. And the moment another thought starts coming in, like, try and banish it, and make it go away. And that's how it can affect. By the way, one of the wonderful aspects of working on this book was meeting some of the people who were affected by the Rebbe. And one of them, indeed, was Yitzchak Bloch, Irving Bloch. And I learned he was a fascinating figure in Chabad because, as Rabbi Bloch mentioned here, he was one of the early ones from the academic world to come to Chabad. Now, one of the things that was interesting is the Rebbe was not a big fan of university education. Interestingly, he had extensive university education because he had gone to schools starting in St. Petersburg, and then, of course, more famously in Germany, and then, of course, he leaves Germany when the Nazis, just before the Nazis come to power, and he ends up studying in France. But nonetheless, he was not encouraging, particularly of his students, to go to college. He certainly didn't want them to go to college if they were going to go, till they were at a later age and their opinions had been formed. But, as I entitled the chapter in it, why people shouldn't go to college and why those who started college shouldn't leave. Because all of a sudden, Irving Bloch is at Harvard. He's in a PhD program in philosophy. But he comes to the yeshiva to learn during the summer, and he really likes it, and he goes to the Rebbe, and he says, I want to leave Harvard, and I want to learn here. And the Rebbe tells him to go back to Harvard. And then later on, when he's struggling with his dissertation, the Rebbe tells him to keep working on it. And then after he gets his PhD, he now finally can learn, and he tells the Rebbe he wants to get ordination, smicha. And the Rebbe says, lo, mit an aleph, no, with a capital N. He didn't want him to. Because the Rebbe said, you have a special mission you can fulfill. You're going to go in there. He was a pious Chabadnik. He had a long beard. He obviously wore a yarmulke. He said, you're going with your Harvard PhD can affect people that our other shluchim can't affect. And he said, and true, that's what happened. He was at first teaching at Brooklyn College. Then he was teaching, he spent decades in London, Ontario. But he said young students would come to him in Brooklyn College, many from religious backgrounds. And they were struck by the fact that this man had gotten a PhD in philosophy at Harvard and still had traditional Jewish beliefs. And it impressed them in a way that they wouldn't have been as impressed, by another rabbi telling them that. By a rabbi telling them that. And so his father didn't want him to get ordained. And the Rebbe had a vision. The Rebbe also shocked him at that first meeting. The Rebbe didn't start talking to him about Judaism. He started talking to him about Plato, where Bloch had focused a lot of his studies on. And one of the fascinating things was, he says, Plato had a lot of cruelty in his philosophy because Plato wanted children taken away from parents at very young ages because he says parents spoil them and don't develop their character in the right way. But when you really think about what Plato was saying is, guess what? That's the philosophy of totalitarian governments. Totalitarian governments want to be the real parents of the child. They don't want the child affected by other things. The Rebbe said, do you know how much cruelty there is in that? Who loves a child more than the child's parents? We know what damage is done to a child who's taken away from his or her parents. And Bloch said he had never heard that critique of Plato at Harvard because Plato was regarded as this amazingly brilliant, significant figure. Years later, he said a major philosopher came out with a critique of Plato, and used the words cruel, and he said, wow, that's exactly what the Rebbe had said. So the Rebbe had a vision, and when you have a vision, you see things in a broader perspective. The fact that everybody says somebody is brilliant, okay, yes, a person can be brilliant, but guess what? A person can be brilliant and can be very cruel. So it had this profound effect on Dr. Block, and that's why I was very moved. One of my early interviews with him was just so important to me. There's another aspect of the Rebbe that hasn't been properly understood. People think of the Rebbe who don't know him as somebody who craved followers. But as Jonathan Sachs once put it, a good leader creates followers. A great leader creates leaders. And that's really what the Rebbe wanted. The very first interview I did for the book was with a man named Label Groner. Groner was was also one of the Rebbe's 3 closest assistants. I mentioned Rabbi Krinsky. Groner was too. And when I came in to interview Groner, he told me, his first 2 children were twins. And there's a halachic question. So should the male, the person who's performing the circumcision, make a separate bracha on each child? Or does one bracha cover both? Anyway, so Groner goes in and asks the Rebbe a question. As a general rule, the Rebbe did not like to answer halachic questions because he didn't want to start a precedent where people would just come to him and then it would disempower, local rabbis. Because obviously if you can go to the great rabbi, so won't go to the others. So Groner sent him, in that case, as Groner told me, he says, go ask Nissen Telushkin, who was my grandfather. So he goes to ask my grandfather, and my grandfather is uncomfortable. He said, the fact that the question was asked of the Rebbe, I feel funny answering it. So he didn't give Groner a definitive answer. Groner goes back to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says to him, look, you have ordination, you have smicha, you studied for the rabbinate, you answer the question. So Groner figures out the answer, which is you do make a separate bracha. He then tells it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe smiles because that's what he thought was the right answer. He wanted Groner, he didn't want people to just be dependent on him. I have a very close friend of mine, Saul Berman, who sits in back of me in shul, was a very close disciple of Rav Soloveitchik. And he said Soloveitchik was the same thing. When a rabbi called to ask Soloveitchik a legal question, he would never answer it right away. He'd say, tell me how you understand the issue, tell me how you've learned it. He didn't want people just being dependent on him like that. And this becomes an important feature. I'll give you another example of the Rebbe. There's a rabbi, Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. I'm telling you his whole name, who was a Chabad shliach, who was sent to New Haven. But remember his name because it's relevant to the story, Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. So in 1954, it's not easy. You become a shliach, you become a Chabad emissary. You go to a city where there aren't many Jews who are into halachic observance. There aren't many Jews who are Chabadniks, and you're trying to raise money also to keep things going. And so Hecht was having a lot of trouble, and he finally, in desperation, wrote a letter to the Rebbe and said, I need you to help me. I need you to take it over. You can solve the whole thing. He gets back the following letter from the Rebbe. I have already done as you have suggested. I sent to New Haven a man named Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. It is apparent that you don't know this man. You don't know the strengths that Moshe Yitzchak Hecht has. When you start trying to get to know those strengths, everything will change. In other words, he sent people back to themselves. And that's where it all begins. Right before I was about to submit the book for publication, and I get a story I can't resist using. Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. Weinreb is a major figure in the Orthodox world. He's not a Chabadnik, but he is a big scholar. He's the Steinsaltz Talmud. You saw Steinsaltz being interviewed in that film. The Steinsaltz Talmud is coming out in an English translation. Weinreb is the editor-in-chief of it. So he's obviously a Talmid Chacham. He's obviously a scholar. But Weinreb tells a story that when he was 30 years old, he was getting a PhD in psychology. He was living in Silver Spring, Maryland. And he started going through a very early midlife crisis. He was married. He had a couple, I think at that point he had 2 children. He couldn't make a career decision. He wasn't sure. Did he want to spend his life? Did he want to teach Talmud? Did he want to become a child psychologist? And a friend of his, a Chabadnik, said, well, why don't you go consult with the Rebbe? And to boot, he was having some issues of faith. He was, it was a real, genuine midlife crisis. So he calls up Chabad, and he speaks to a man who he later on realized was Rabbi Chodakov. and periodically you'd hear a voice from the background making a comment, and asking, so at a certain point, the person from the background says, "Who is it you're speaking to?" And Weinrib didn't want to say his whole name then because he thought he might want to keep his identity anonymous. If he would go see the Rebbe, he would say his name, but in the meantime, he wasn't anxious to share all his doubts and other things. So he said, "A Jew from Maryland." The conversation continues, more and more questions are asked. Finally, he hears that voice from the back says, "Tell him to go speak to a rabbi in Maryland named Weinrib." Now, this was before caller ID, so Weinrib had heard what the Rebbe had said, but it sounded too peculiar. So when he was asked, "Did you hear what the Rebbe said?" He said, "No, tell me again." And they said, "Tell him to go consult with a Jew in Maryland. His name is Weinrib." He says, "I'm Weinrib." So at this point, Rabbi Chodakov is shocked. And he says to the Rebbe, "This is Weinrib." And the Rebbe says, "Azoy, if that's the case, tell him to consult with himself." Weinrib said that story transformed his life. He said he was by nature of a nervous disposition, and whenever a problem would arise, he'd start asking this person and that person. He'd constantly asking people for advice. He said ever since that happened, the first person he asks for advice is himself. He says he goes to a chair, he leans back, and he thinks, what do I really want to see happen? So many of us don't do that. So the Rebbe would send people back to themselves. It's not widely known that Jonathan Sacks, who became this extraordinarily distinguished chief rabbi of England, claims that what motivated him to become a rabbi was a meeting he had with the Rebbe when he was only 21 years old. And one of the things that happened at that meeting was he said to the Rebbe, "I recently found myself in a situation," and the Rebbe said, "Don't use that expression." He said, "Don't say I found myself in a situation. You placed yourself in a situation." That expression is tremendously liberating, because if you can place yourself in one situation, then you can choose to place yourself in another situation. If your life continues always thinking in passive terms, I found myself in a situation, things always seem to be happening to you. You lose the ability then, in a sense, to shape your destiny. This is yet another aspect of what the Rebbe was talking about. Another one is about the usage of positive language, which I have become convinced has most influenced me in my life. I was influenced in that direction even before I was really looking into what the Rebbe was saying, because years ago I had written a book called Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, how the words we choose shape our destiny. But the Rebbe just also reinforced it in what I learned about it and his insistence. So I gave you one example before. He didn't want people to use the term Beit Cholim. He wanted people to use the term Beit Refuah, a house of healing. In Israel, there's an expression, Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. It refers to Israeli soldiers who suffered very, very serious wounds, crippling wounds. Anyway, a group of Nechei Tzahal, of the handicapped of Tzahal, are brought to the United States in '76 by the IDF, in part to consult with doctors here and also to give them something pleasant, because many of them were young men, 20, 21, 22, 23, who suddenly lives had been changed in a terrible way. They bring them over also to Chabad, and the Rebbe meets with them. And the Rebbe says how honored he is to meet with them. And then the Rebbe says something remarkable. He says, I know in Israel they call you Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. Why do they define you only by what you can't do? He said it's a known fact that many people who suffer handicaps develop compensatory abilities. Suddenly blind people develop a more acute sense of hearing and notice things others wouldn't. If you would Google people who paint without the usage of arms, you will be shocked at the level of painting you will see of people who paint using brushes in their mouth or even with their toes. So why then define you by what you can't do and not by what you can do and can do extraordinarily well? Why, instead of calling you Nechei Tzahal, why can't they call you Mitzuyanei Tzahal, the excellent ones of Tzahal? I read that and it reminded me of a memoir I had read of a soldier in World War II who lost his arms.
and he was sent to an army rehabilitation hospital. And he remembered the day before he and other soldiers were released, a high officer in the army came to speak to them, and practicing a form of what they now call tough love, he said to them, "You're going to go out tomorrow, and you're all Army heroes. But in a year from now, you're going to be disabled Army veterans. And a year after that, you're just going to be cripples." The power of words to affect people. The Rebbe was so acute and powerful in his usage of it. One of the terms, he didn't like to use negative words. He wouldn't say even a Russia. As a general rule, he wouldn't say a Russia, an evil person. He'll say the opposite of a tzaddik. It can almost sound humorous, but it's a whole different way of viewing it, of viewing people. Jewish life also puts such an emphasis on intellectual achievement. So among secular Jews, they'll say of a child who's not really smart, he's no Einstein. In the religious world, they'll say he's no Vilna Gaon. But, it's terrible. People don't need to hear that. All of us have been hurt. All of us have been wounded by negative words. And there are positive words that can be used. By the way, one of the terms that I got influenced by the Rebbe to stop using was a term which all writers use, which is deadline. Think about it. What does that connote? It actually dates back to the Civil War, when in Confederate Army prison camps for Union prisoners, they had a deadline. If you went past that line, they could shoot you. But it's, obviously, even without knowing, there's a big argument invariably among word people about, is that it? I think that's it. But, it's a terrible term. I came up, ever since then, I no longer speak of a deadline. I speak of a due date. Think of the difference. A deadline connotes death. A due date connotes birth. I remember I didn't know whether it was nachas or not. Somebody came and said, the Rebbe said you're not supposed to use deadline. You're supposed to use due date. And I realized I had come up with that. The Rebbe, used other terms. But it's funny, when you write something, you never know what it'll be. That's why I want to be very careful. I don't want to have people attribute things to the Rebbe that he might not have wanted to say, but you do it. But in any case, the use of positive language. I was very punctilious in writing the book and not using anonymous material. And I'll tell you why. You never know whether an anonymous story is accurate. Anonymous stories often have elements in it that sound less believable. But there was one anonymous story I did put in. Sometimes I would maintain anonymity because there was a good reason why somebody did not want their identity revealed. But overwhelmingly, that was not the case. But one anonymous story I did put in, a man came to the Rebbe and he was complaining his life was so hard and he had raised his children in the Jewish way, and now one of them was not religious and he said, you know what they say, it's hard to be a Jew. How many of you are familiar with that expression? Yeah, in one way or another. It's a commonly used expression in Yiddish, and its English was also commonly used. The Rebbe looked at the man and said, I'm curious, do you often use that expression? So the man said, well, it is hard to be a Jew. So the Rebbe said, so then why are you so surprised your son doesn't want to be a Jew? Why don't you start saying, es ist gut zu sein a Yid, it's good to be a Jew, and give him a whole different approach. The hour, okay, it's getting a little late, and I had actually I wanted to quickly review the 613 commandments, but I'm going to skip that. Some people got a little nervous. Okay. But I want to make one other interesting point. The Rebbe tried to avoid conflict. One of the people I interviewed from the book, Michael Seligson, is a scholar who compiled a 1,600-page index of all of the Rebbe's public speeches that he gave during his year as Rebbe. And he told me he could find almost no instances where the Rebbe ever attacked someone by name. The Rebbe used to say, I speak about shitot, I don't speak about people. I speak about approaches, I don't speak about individuals. A rabbi wrote a very critical letter to the Rebbe. He was angry at a position the Rebbe took. It was during this whole controversy in Israel. I think it most likely was the Mihu Yehudi, who was a Jew. And he spoke, he wrote in a really nasty way. The Rebbe wrote back to him. He said, this is terrible. I suddenly forgot what the Rebbe said. Wait a second. He said, why should our whole relationship be defined by this disagreement? There are 612 areas in which we agree.
Obviously, he was referring to the 613 laws in the Torah. But you all know what I mean. You know how feuds take place, personal animuses take place, where people focus the entirety of their relationship on somebody else on an area in which they have a disagreement. What was accomplished by the fact that the Rebbe wouldn't attack people personally, even though he attacked positions? What was accomplished by it? I saw this repeatedly in the book. He maintained the ability to work with people that he couldn't otherwise work with. Look at the climate of what's going on in America now, the personal animus in political things. And people say, well, we need more bipartisanship. You can't have bipartisanship if people are constantly attacking the integrity of other people. How quickly would you be willing to work with somebody who had used very abusive terms to describe you? And I'm not even going just one side or the other. It's done both by the left and the right. And it's terrible. And you can't. And the Rebbe wouldn't do that. The Rebbe took firm positions on issues. I was shocked when I was looking over something the Rebbe had said after Jimmy Carter was president. And you can imagine the Rebbe had profound disagreements with things Carter had done. He said, yet there were also good things he'd done, and we can't lose sight of all of them. And so this was just a very remarkable feature. Every 4 years, I'll ask people, during the presidential race, can you think of a single reason somebody voted for the candidate whom you oppose that doesn't reflect badly either on their intelligence or on their character? I rarely find liberals or conservatives who can think of a single reason somebody might have voted for the other person that doesn't reveal them either to be a little stupid or something wrong with their heart. And it's a terrible thing. And I'll tell you what makes it so terrible. Because sometimes the people who disagree with you, you know, are actually intelligent people. So if they're taking a position that you think is wicked or wrong, it could only be because they're wicked or wrong. And that's leading to an increasing demonization of each side of the other. The Rebbe never demonized. And that, if the Rebbe has an important lesson to teach us, believe me, that's one of it. So just look at some of the areas that we've spoken about in the last few minutes. The power of love and the power of moral imagination. And what he said to Rabbi Lau, Kirav Rechokim, who are we to know who's near and who's far? They're all precious in God's eyes. His notions about the usage of positive language. He didn't want to use words like deadline or other things. And he didn't want to use a word like Beit Cholim. He wanted to speak in terms of a Beit Refuah, of a house of healing. And what we know, how harsh people could be. His notions on leadership, what he said to Jonathan Sachs, don't say you found yourself in a situation, say you placed yourself in a situation. He didn't want to elevate things into feuds because he said you can argue and argue harshly over a matter, but the moment you start regarding the person who has a different position than you as wicked, you've lost the ability to work with that person. You know, obviously we can all come up with very extreme cases. Listen, the Rebbe himself was the victim of the two most wicked regimes of the 20th century, because his father was basically murdered by the communists in Russia, and he saw what they did, and obviously he then lived in Germany during the time the Nazis came to power. But in the normal order of events, that's what we're speaking about. I just want to conclude with one final story. Avram Berkowitz was a young shliach. He wasn't yet a shliach, because you only become a shliach when you're married, because the Rebbe only believed in sending out couples as shluchim. But as a young man, he was not yet married. He went out. Somebody guessed before that Alaska was the last place, but it wasn't. Alaska has had a shliach there since the 70s, but he used to go out with a friend about probably 25 years ago. They used to go in the summers to Alaska, and they found an Israeli pilot who was working for an Alaskan airline. And you know, Chabadniks are known, they can be a little aggressive. You know, when they want to make something happen, they'll do what they can to make it happen. So they found an Israeli pilot who agreed that whenever he had empty seats on his plane, he was flying all around Alaska, he would call them, and they would go with him. And they would go for a few hours to a city that normally nobody would ever reach. So they arrive at a city in the northwest Yupok territory, and the pilot says, you have a few hours here. They immediately go and find the mayor. It's largely a Native American, Native American, we normally think of what we call American Indians. Obviously, in Alaska, it's what used to be called Eskimos and now are Inuits. And so they find the mayor of the town, and they ask him if any Jews live there. There are a few thousand people in the city. They find him, are there any Jews living there? And he said, not that I know of, but he knows enough to recognize, he knows what Jews are, and he knows enough to recognize that these two young men are obviously religious Jews. And he says to them, at our elementary school here, kids will never meet a Jew in their lives. Why don't you go there and tell them a little about being Jewish in your lives? So they go to the elementary school, and they're there, I think, with like 4th through 8th graders, and they tell them a little about Judaism. They do a Hasidic dance for them. The kids do an Inuit dance, and the time is coming to an end. And Berkowitz, he has a mandate from the Rebbe, so he asks, he said, has anybody here ever met a Jew? And a young girl raises her hand and says, I know a Jew. So he says, who? She says, my mother. And the girl was clearly of Inuit appearance. She points to her mother, and he stays afterwards, and he's speaking to the mother and the girl. The mother, as they say in Alaska, she came from the lower 48. She came from a Jewish family, felt positive about her Jewishness, had gone there in Alaska, fallen in love with an Inuit man. And then she says to Berkowitz, she said, you might well be the only rabbi. He wasn't even ordained yet. You might well be the only rabbi my daughter will ever meet in her life. Tell her something about the importance of being Jewish. So he had this is a one-shot opportunity. Think about what you would answer. So what he said to the girl was, he said, there's a very special law in Judaism. Every Friday night to Saturday night is called the Sabbath. And Jews refrain from other activities on that day. It's just to turn inward. You're not producing other things, you're going inward. And he said to her, and who inaugurates the Sabbath? Every week it's inaugurated by Jewish women. Jewish women light candles. And it starts all the way in the east as the sun goes down. So where does it start? The girl's mother taught geography at the school, so she knew. She said, yeah, probably in New Zealand or in Australia. He says, that's right. Jewish women are lighting candles there, and then it moves across Asia, and it moves across Europe, and it comes to the United States, and candles are lit in New York, and in Chicago, and in Seattle, and then here, and then the only place left is the Northwest Yupik Territory, and the whole Jewish world is waiting for you to light candles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Telushkin, for this inspiring, uplifting talk on the teachings of the Rebbe and how we could incorporate some of those teachings in our own lives and our own relationships. I'm kind of wondering whether we should have some questions, or is it late? What do you think? So who would like to have an opportunity to ask some questions? Raise your hand. Well, the two people who raised their hands could ask them. So we'll have a chance for 1 or 2 questions and short questions, and then we'll break up for some refreshments. Thank you.
Short question, probably short answer.
Okay. Yes.
I'm just curious about the Rebbe's view towards the founding of Israel and the growth of Israel. What was his pro-Israel? Was it mixed, or what was his view?
Okay, so now you asked me a great question which will not have a short answer. Okay. Because it's very important. Chabad, like most of what is thought of as Chabad, like most of what is thought of as the ultra-Orthodox world, was originally for decades anti-Zionist. My grandfather, who I mentioned, was very close to the Rebbe and very close to Chabad. That was his one fundamental area of disagreement, because my grandfather really was a fervent Zionist. I would argue that one of the great achievements of the Rebbe was he moved Chabad from being anti-Zionist to being non-Zionist. And I'll tell you why, and people shouldn't get offended when I say he was a non-Zionist. Ideologically, there's no way Chabad could have been Zionist, because the whole notion of a secular Jewish state doesn't really accord with Jewish, with the normal religious sensibility.
On the other hand, there would be a lot of problems if a Jewish state was run strictly according to Jewish law. So why do I say he moved Chabad from being anti-Zionist to being non-Zionist? First of all, anybody who's familiar with the Rebbe knows that his devotion to Israel, his devotion to Israeli soldiers, so in every practical sense of the term, it was religious. When Netanyahu became the ambassador to the UN, which was his original position, he came to the Rebbe, and he always quoted what the Rebbe said. He quoted it in a speech at the UN just a few years ago. He said, the Rebbe, said to him, you're going to a place of great darkness. You can shine some light there. Rabbi Klein, who is yet a third one of the Rebbe's very close secretaries, told me that Klein was sort of in charge of Chabad Israel relations. He gets a call one day. It was the head of the cabinet office there. He later on became an attorney general of Israel, and I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he said, Yitzchak Shamir wants to speak to you, wants to have a message for the Rebbe. Shamir was, of course, politically a right-wing prime minister of Israel, but unlike Begin, who had a very strong traditional sensibility, Shamir really was a pretty secular figure. And he wondered what the message was going to be. And then he's told that Israeli intelligence has uncovered PLO plans of several acts of terrorism. So he probably assumed that one of them might be directed at Chabad. But he said, and Prime Minister Shamir wants to ask the Rebbe to make special prayers. So people, just saw, they knew that the Rebbe had this extraordinary love. The person who I think really started the process of moving over Chabad was the Rebbe's father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe. And I found that out from the writings of Zalman Shazar. Zalman Shazar was a president of Israel, and as you could guess with the name Zalman, he had a Chabad background. And he had grown up, really like that. But his grandfather, the fifth Rebbe, it was the fifth Rebbe, had been very anti-Zionist. Because remember, Zionism in its early days was also quite aggressively secular and didn't have good feelings about what was going on in religious Jewish life and felt Jews had to become much more activist. Anyway, so Shazar is sent to the United States in 1947 because they're about to have a partition vote. Don't you wish you would ask the shorter question? They were about to have the partition vote at the United Nations on whether there should be a Jewish state. And he was sent, he was part of the Labor Party, later on became president of Israel. He calls up, and the Frierdiker Rebbe invites him to come visit him. And he comes to visit him. And first of all, on the phone, the Rebbe says to him, the UN's going to pass it. There is going to be a Jewish state. And then, a short time after that vote, because the vote was at the very end of November of 47, a few weeks later is the major Chabad celebration, the 19th of Kislev, and he goes, and the Rebbe says, you're going to have a Jewish state, and I want you to establish a city, and that's where he starts speaking to him about Kfar Chabad, the Chabad city. And Shazar's a little taken aback, and he says, your father basically expelled my grandfather. My grandfather was expelled from his household largely because of your father's opposition to Zionism. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't want to get into a whole discussion of that. He said, that was then, this is now. And so there really was a change. And the 67 war was a very, very dramatic thing because the Rebbe, there was real panic. Sometimes we forget. Well, those of us who are younger don't forget. They didn't live through it. How many people here were around when the 67 war happened? Okay, and for those of you, I'm 70 now, so I was in my late teens then. As you can imagine, there was a real panic in American Jewish life, and there was a panic in Israel. Goren, who was then the chief rabbi of the army, they were looking over plots that could accommodate 25,000 graves. They didn't know what was going to happen. And the Egyptians, they really were using those. It's not like made-up propaganda. They really were saying, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. And the Rebbe was so aggressive. And at Lag BaOmer that year, which is it happened to be coincidentally just at the time when it was starting, the Rebbe was saying, if there's going to be a war, we're going to win. There's nothing to worry about. And it got headlined. It got headlined even in the newspaper of Mapam, which was the most left-wing liberal newspaper, secular newspaper you could have in Israel, because he really had that confidence. And then the number of Israeli generals. By the way, I have a wonderful exchange in my book. My favorite exchanges are, as you could tell, I do not like conflict. So my favorite exchanges are in the book where somebody has a great line and the other person also has a great line. Rather than one person defeating somebody. Sharon, before he was prime minister, comes and visits the Rebbe at 770, and he says to the Rebbe, "Why don't you make Aliyah?" He said, "You know how important it is?" He said, "In the Israeli army, it's known that the commanders say, 'Follow me.' And if you made Aliyah, you know how many other Jews would make Aliyah as a result?" It was actually a tremendous challenge. You know what the Rebbe answered? He says, "The Israeli army and follow me is one example. Another example are ships." Remember, the Rebbe was an engineer, and the Rebbe's expertise was in ships. And he said, on ships, the commander is the last one to leave. He says, when all the other Jews leave, he says, then I'll be ready to make Aliyah. So, but, because you have to take care of these Jewish communities all over the world. So this is a very powerful image. So Chabad becomes tremendously pro-Israel. Now, it so happens I had areas, I told the people in Chabad, they were unbelievably generous in opening up, as far as I could tell, everybody to me. But I had areas of disagreement on this issue because I, for example, thought the Israeli peace treaty with Egypt was actually a pretty good thing, because prior to the peace treaty with Egypt, there had been 5 wars with Egypt, in 48, and 56, and 67. Then the war, which is often forgotten today, but in which actually more Israelis died in 68, 69. It was not a formal war. Yeah, the war of attrition actually had more Israeli soldiers died. I was at a yeshiva in Israel then when 2 boys were killed during that year. And then, of course, the 73 war. And since then, the Rebbe thought it would ultimately lead to more Jewish deaths. I don't know if any of you noticed, by odd coincidence today, I think Morsi died, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. But in any case, and they said, but it was very interesting. Zalman Schmatkin said, if you have an area of disagreement, put it on the front of the book. In fact, what he also said to me was, this is very funny, he said, Joseph, because he saw how deeply influenced I was, he says, Joseph, if you want to become a Chabadnik, that'll be great, but not until after your book comes out. He said, because he wanted to have the book written by somebody who was clearly very attuned to Chabad, but was not from within inside. And in fact, one very prominent Chabad shliach said to me, I envy you. I said, why? He says, because I couldn't write the book the way you're writing it. Because when Chabadniks speak about the Rebbe, there's a different way of writing. But anyway, the Rebbe's commitment to Israel was incredibly deep. And I think, it changed. First of all, even the issue of being an anti-Zionist or a Zionist, what does that mean? Think about it. In the United States, could somebody have opposed the American Revolutionary War against the British? Yeah, before it happened, somebody could say, without being a traitor, we're better off being part with England. But once an American country comes into existence, if you cooperate with the British, you become a traitor. To be anti-Zionist before a state was established is one thing. But once the state exists, to be anti-Zionist and support anti-Zionists who want to destroy the state means you're going to be supporting the killing of Jews and the elimination of a Jewish state. So the Rebbe becomes one of the foremost figures, and every Israeli leader has recognized that. Should we have one more question? I promise I'll give a short answer. No. I think I've scared everybody out of asking any more questions. Okay, this is great. We've been talking about this for a while. Dr. Cohen, I'm very grateful to you. Mrs. Cohen, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to all the blocks. I also had one of the best meals of my life before this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Telushkin, for visiting us in San Antonio. We wish you a very safe trip home and much hatzlacha in all your wonderful, wonderful endeavors, and many more books to come. L'chaim. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. There's some great refreshments in the back. Please help yourselves.